All right, so we are in lesson 16 still, so you should have the lesson 16 doc pulled up. And for this section, I'm not going to just break it down exactly what you should write for number one, because number one's asking for 3 different conditions in medieval towns that led to the spread of the disease. So we're going to go through a lot of them, and you can pick which 3 you want. So this is all about disease and medical treatment. So unhealthy living conditions in medieval towns led to the spread of disease. Towns were very dirty places. There was no running water in the homes, and instead of bathrooms, people were using outdoor privies, which were shelters used as toilets, or chamber pots, which is pretty much just going in a bucket that they emptied into nearby streams and canals. And these streams and canals is where people are washing their clothes, getting their water. Garbage, too, was tossed into streams and canals or onto the streets. People lived crowded together in small spaces and usually bathed once a week, if that. So rats and fleas were very common and often carried diseases. If you've ever been to like a Renaissance festival, you'll notice that a lot of people on their belts have a cup. And so on that cup, they keep it on their belt so that they're not sharing those germs. And so they kept those supplies with them. Rats and fleas were common and often carried diseases, and it's no wonder people were frequently ill. Many illnesses that could be prevented or cured today had no cures in medieval times. One example is leprosy, a disease of the skin and nerves that cause open sores. Because leprosy can spread from one person to another and can cause death, lepers were ordered to live by themselves in isolated houses, usually far from the towns. Some towns even passed laws to keep out lepers. So number 2, what were some common diseases in medieval Europe? Common diseases in which there was no cure at this time included measles, cholera, smallpox, and scarlet fever. The most feared disease was the bubonic plague, known as the Black Death, and we'll cover that as soon as we get back in person. No one knew exactly how diseases were spread. Unfortunately, this made many people look for someone to blame. For example, after an outbreak of illness, Jews, often a target of unjust anger and suspicion, were sometimes accused of poisoning the wells. Although hospitals were invented during the Middle Ages, there were few of them. When sickness struck, most people were treated in their homes by family members or sometimes a doctor. So number 3 is asking, what were some common practices or treatments used by medical doctors? So medieval doctors believed in a combination of prayer and medical treatment, many involving herbs. Using herbs as medicine had a long history based on traditional folk wisdom and knowledge handed down from ancient Greece and Rome. Other treatments were based on less scientific methods. For example, medieval doctors sometimes consulted the poisons of the planets the positions of the planets and relied on magic charms to heal people. Another common technique was to bleed patients by opening a vein or applying leeches, yes, leeches, a type of worm, to the skin, and it would suck out the blood. They believed that this bloodletting helped restore balance to the body and spirit. Unfortunately, such treatments often weakened a patient further. All right, you can go on to section 6. Section 6 is all about crime and punishment. So the first question says, describe 2 methods for deciding the guilt or innocence of accused criminals in the early Middle Ages. Besides being unhealthy, medieval towns were noisy and smelly, crowded and often unsafe. Pickpocketers and thieves were always on the lookout for vulnerable travelers with money in their pouches. Towns were especially dangerous at night because there were no streetlights. In some cities, night watchmen patrolled the streets with candle lanterns to deter or discourage criminals. People accused of crimes were held in dirty, crowded jails. Prisoners relied on friends and family to bring them food or money, or else they risked starving or being ill-treated. Wealthy people sometimes left money in their wills to help prisoners buy food. So what were some ways that they decided guilt or innocence? So this is question number 1. In the early Middle Ages, trial by ordeal or combat was often used to establish an accused person's guilt or innocence. In a trial by ordeal, the accused had to pass a dangerous test, such as being thrown into a deep well. Unfortunately, a person who floated instead of drowning was declared guilty because he or she had been rejected by the water. Okay, so let's get this straight. So if you float to the surface of the well, okay, so a well is like a deep well. Think of like the movie Lassie, if you've ever seen that, okay? You can't get out on your own. So if you come to the top of the surface, you live because you're not drowning, but they also thought you were guilty. But if you had sunk to the bottom, you die, but then you're innocent. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. They also had trial by combat. The accused person had to fight to prove his or her innocence. People believed that God would ensure the right party won. Clergy, women, children, and disabled people could name a champion to fight on their behalf. So there you go for number 1. Number 2, again, if I'm going too fast, pause the video. What were some ways in which criminals were punished? That's going to be here in blue. I highlight it. Punishments for crime were very harsh. For lesser crimes, people were fined or put in the stocks, a wooden frame with holes for the person's arms and sometimes legs. Being left in the stocks publicly for hours a day was both painful and humiliating. I mean, think of how embarrassing it would be to be in the town square and your arms and your head is stuck in this like wooden thing that comes down. Think of like, again, the Renaissance Festival has these. I think there's even one at Governor Bev. And so people would pass by you. Sometimes they throw like rotten vegetables at you, making fun of you. So it's just like a humiliating thing for those lesser crimes, okay? People found guilty of crimes such as highway robbery, stealing livestock, treason against your country, or murder could be hung or burned at the stake. Executions were carried out in public, often in front of large crowds, thinking that would deter people from committing that same crime. All right, number 3. What changes to the court system helped protect individual rights in the early 1100s in England? Okay, so I've highlighted that in orange here. In most parts of Europe, important nobles shared with monarchs the power to prosecute major crimes. In England, kings in the early 1100s began creating a nationwide system of royal courts. The decisions of royal judges contributed to a growing body of common law. Along with the independent judiciary or court system, English common law would become an important safeguard of individual rights. Throughout Europe, court trials based on written or oral evidence eventually replaced trials by ordeal or combat. So that's really good. So they get rid of those trials by ordeal or combat and actually replace it with a court system to decide if you're guilty or not.